Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to be in the Faroe Islands. I was invited here 50 years ago, and I've come. I remember sitting in the room in Cambridge where my wife lived, and there was a man who'd visited the Faroe Islands many times. And he said, you know, I think you ought to go to the Faroe Islands. So I'm very slow. And as a result, I'm here. And thank you for your invitation and the warmth of your welcome, which has been so impressive that I already feel very much at home. Yes, I have been to many large countries, but you see, I come from a small country. I come from Northern Ireland, and I come from a small town of 10,000 people. So I'm particularly comfortable when I'm in small places. And it's wonderful to be here. And I'm particularly honored tonight to have as my discussion partner, Peter Dahl. We've had a marvelous discussion over dinner when he has introduced me to some of the wonders of the history of the Faroe Islands and of its language and the relationship between the different Nordic languages and the rich tradition that you have here to share with the rest of the world. Now, I have an apology to make. This is Thursday, and I can only speak Faroese on Mondays to Wednesdays. And so I have to subject you to my English, which is massively impressive. We English have a very, well, I'm not English, actually, I'm Irish, but there we are. We do not have a good reputation for learning foreign languages. But I assure you, I appreciate your difficulty because I do speak several languages. It's just that Faroese does not happen to be one of them. So thank you very much for enduring me in English this evening. The next thing I want to say is that we are dealing with a very complex and serious topic. Is religion poisonous? And I know that many of you will have questions. Peter very kindly is going to lead off by asking me some questions, but we're both looking forward to hearing your questions and dealing with them best we can. I'll tell you just a little about my background, which will help you understand why I do what I do. My parents were Christian, but very unusually for Northern Ireland, they were not sectarian. And that's relevant to our topic this evening. My father employed both Protestants and Catholics in his small business, and we were bombed for it. So I know the results of religious violence. The second thing is, which was equally unusual, my parents allowed me to think. They did not decide for me what I should believe or should not believe. And so when I went to Cambridge in the last century sometime, not the previous one, although it may look like it, when I went to Cambridge, my faith in God did not disappear like that of many of my contemporaries, for the simple reason that I'd thought about it and discussed it. But when I got to college, you see, I was challenged in the first week. A student said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh, sorry, you're Irish. All you Irish believe in God and you fight about it." Now, of course, I'd heard that before. But it seemed to me that now I had a unique opportunity to get to know as friends people who did not share my background, people who did not share my worldview. And on that day, I befriended an agnostic. And I've spent my life befriending people who do not share my worldview. That's a very long story. I studied in Germany, learnt the language, which opened up Eastern Europe, particularly the German Democratic Republic before the wall fell. So I was able to see what atheism does within a culture. But when the wall fell, and I helped to knock it down, I'm delighted to say, just a little bit, but I did help. I then started going to Russia, where I also speak the language, and interacting with many people in the Academy of Sciences and in the universities, particularly in Siberia, was able again to talk seriously to people about their worldview. And all of that was, in a way, a preparation for debating people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and many others of the leading atheist thinkers of the world. That's just to explain to you where I'm coming from. We're all coming from somewhere. And our topic tonight, is religion poisonous, is particularly important to me because it was that question of that student in Cambridge that changed the course of my life. I'd been born in Ireland, my parents Christian, their parents Christian, their parents Christian. Of course I was a Christian, it's Irish genetics. Was that simply the case or not? And I wanted to know the answer because I wasn't interested so much in faith in God being a help. I wanted to know whether it was true or not. And that's how I spent my life. So that's a little very brief history. Much more importantly, of course, I have one wife and I have 3 children and 7 grandchildren. And I'm only sorry my wife is not here to enjoy these lovely islands. So then, what do we say to the question about religion being poisonous? Now, the title is a part quotation because the man who said religion poisons everything was Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens. And my motivation really for writing a book on the topic was a debate we had at the Edinburgh Festival some years ago. The Edinburgh Festival is one of the leading culture festivals in Europe, and for some unknown reason, its organizer said, we're going to start this year with a God debate. This had never happened before. And we were even honored by the presence of Richard Dawkins, who came, as he put on his website, to see Christopher Hitchens hang me, which was a very endearing thought, of course. But Christopher Hitchens was a war correspondent. I got to know him a little bit and got to begin to sympathize with his negative, very negative reaction to religion. Because he traveled around the world watching Sikhs kill Muslims, killing Christians, killing Buddhists, killing Hindus, and so on. And you know that around the world at the moment there are many wars with some kind of religious dimension to them. And that has meant that some very vocal people and also some very eminent people have decided that this is enough. And 9/11 was a trigger. At least they claim it was a trigger. There was an article a few years ago in Der Spiegel, which is the German equivalent of Time magazine, and the headline was, Gott ist an allem schuld. God is to blame for everything. And it had a photo of the Twin Towers. And Richard Dawkins claims that it was 9/11 that radicalized him. And so the idea is very simple, and for that reason it has a very powerful appeal. 9/11 is religion. It's unacceptable in our world. So we need to get rid of religion. And if you say that it's extremist religion, they will agree, yes. But where does extremist religion come from? It comes from moderate religion. So we've got to get rid of all religion. And there was a very high-profile conference at the Salk Institute for Biological Science in La Jolla in California a while back, where the interesting thing was they decided that science was going to be the means of getting rid of religion. Nothing else was contemplated. And Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, said at that conference, perhaps the greatest contribution of science to this generation will be to get rid of religion. And then he said this, and anything we scientists can do to get rid of religion ought to be done. I find that quite chilling. It smacked of a totalitarian attitude. So that's really to explain to you in part the origin of what is called the new atheism. It's a reaction against the unacceptable face of violent religion. And it's claiming that science is the tool that's got to be used to abolish religion completely. Now, I am a scientist, and I speak and write about these things, but that's not our topic tonight. I'm facing tonight the serious question, is religion poisonous? Hitchens went further, actually, and he said religion poisons everything. Religion poisons everything. And I meet many people whose experience of religion, yes, even Christian religion, has been effectively poisonous. It has put them off thinking about God, and it has turned them into atheists or agnostics or something else. Because, of course, it's obvious, not all worldviews are healthy. And so we've got to investigate the question with a great deal of humility. Because I don't know whether I have been responsible for making some people think that what I believe in about God is poisonous. I hope I haven't. But I'm well aware that it is possible. Now, religion is too broad a category in more than one sense. Other religions, other than Christianity, I am a Christian, have got the perfect right to speak for themselves when charged with violence. And they must do that. I cannot speak for them, obviously. But I do wish to speak for Christianity and talk about it. And I notice that Dawkins and Hitchens and many others focus on Christianity. Christopher Hitchens says that he is really a Protestant atheist, which is a lovely category, of course. People used to say to me in Ireland, you don't meet real atheists, you just meet Protestant atheists or Catholic atheists. You meet the real ones in England. Well, that may well be true, of course. So, and Richard Dawkins claims that Anglicanism is the thing he knows best, so he's going to attack that. And of course, that brings me immediately back home, because I come from Northern Ireland. And people frequently say to me, look, you know, how can you possibly maintain any faith in God when you look at the history of your own country? Because there has been violence in the name of God. Now, I'm perfectly aware, of course, that historians will point out that the situation in my home country is much more complicated than reducing to a simple religious equation. I know that. But the impression given around the world is Northern Ireland, Christianity, violence, and we get singing John Lennon's song, Imagine. Do you know the song, Imagine? Imagine a world without the Taliban, so on, and without Northern Ireland. Well, how anybody could imagine the world without Northern Ireland, I just don't know, but there it is. And you can understand what they are saying. Because they agree with Bertrand Russell, who once said, my view of religion is that of Lucretius, the famous Epicurean philosopher. I regard religion as a disease born of fear and a source of untold misery to the human race. So what do I say about it? What do I say about the bombing of my father's own store? What do I say about the fact that my brother nearly lost his life, lost an eye, had his face damaged as a result of one of the bombings? What do I say? I'm going to be very honest, ladies and gentlemen. What I first say is I'm utterly ashamed of it. Utterly and completely and thoroughly ashamed. I'm ashamed that the name of Christ has ever been associated with a bomb or an AK-47 or a Molotov cocktail. So that's where I start. Shame. But now I wish to explain why I'm ashamed of it. You see, the interesting thing is this. There was a trial, the most famous trial in all of history as I regard it, the trial of Jesus Christ. And I used to wonder, why is it that the gospel historians go to such lengths to give us detail about that trial? Why do they not just talk about the crucifixion and the resurrection and so on? I think the answer to that is now pretty clear. Because Christ was accused and tried on the charge that's before us this evening. Religion is violent, and you, Jesus Christ, are causing violence starting in Galilee and reaching up here. In other words, Jesus was accused of the very thing that the new atheists now accuse Christianity of. I pointed that out to Christopher Hitchens, and I said, Christopher, I just don't understand you. And he said, why not? Well, I said, you see, you are accusing Christians of the same thing Christ was accused of, and he hadn't realized that. Now, the important thing for us to realize next is Pilate, who was a clever and powerful Roman soldier, was allergic to anybody claiming that they were a king and they were interested in a violent political overthrow of the Roman occupation. So he conducted the trial himself, which is very unusual. In his eyes, of course, Jesus was some little upstart. Normally, a very junior lawyer would have conducted the trial, but he conducted it himself. And he was running the country. And so the question was put to Jesus, are you a king? In the political sense, of course. Are you a threat to Rome? The answer was this. You have said, I am a king. Yes, I am a king in that sense. But not in the sense you think, for my kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise, my servants would have been fighting so that I should not be delivered to the Jewish authorities, "My kingdom is not now of this world. No, rather to this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth." And Pilate famously said, "What is truth?" I'm not sure that he was being cynical. I think maybe he was thinking, what on earth has truth got to do with politics and power and violence? It's got to do with philosophy departments, hasn't it? And he went out to the crowd and said he found Jesus innocent. This is vastly important, ladies and gentlemen. You see, people that take up weapons, as they've done sadly in my country, to defend Christ and his message, are not following him. They're denying him. So by definition, they're not Christian, because a Christian is a follower of Jesus. And you will remember, won't you, the story. Perhaps you've never read it. It's a very interesting story. That when they came to arrest Jesus, a couple of the disciples had managed to find swords. They weren't very good at using them. So Peter took a terrific swipe with a sword, and he was trying to cut the head off a man, but he missed, and he cut his ear off. Do you remember that? Very interesting story. Now, I can't go into it now. You may want to ask me afterwards. I actually believe that Christ literally restored the ear. But you'd be very dull not to see the subtext. And it's this: if you use weapons to defend Christ, you will cut the ears off people in a very big way. See, many of my atheist friends, and I have many, and I have friends in other religions, many, but they won't listen to what I have to say about the Christian message. Why? Their ears are cut off because they've seen the violence that results from disobeying Christ. I can't make that point too strongly. What happened in Northern Ireland, the religious dimension, results from disobeying Christ's explicit command to put the sword away. "My kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would have been fighting." And of course Pilate knew that what he said was correct, because Pilate would have had the report of the centurion who led the arrest party, and he would have known about the incident with the sword, and that Jesus repaired the man's ear and told the disciples not to be so silly. So this is the first major point tonight, ladies and gentlemen, on the side of Christianity. People who take weapons to defend Christ or his message are not Christian. Now, the existence of counterfeit money, you wouldn't have any in the Faroes, I'm sure, but we have lots of it in England, I think. The existence of false money does not prove that the real stuff doesn't exist, but it can make it hard to find if there's enough of it. And it's very important for me in this world where there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of fog, people don't even know what Christianity claims. They used to in my country, they don't anymore. To clear up this historical dimension. That is why history is such an important discipline, because history can correct false ideas of what is going on. So that's my first point. And I said to Hitchens, I said, "Christopher, if you realized that Jesus Christ is just as against exploitative, violent religion as you are, you'd be arguing on his side, not fighting against him. I just don't understand you. You obviously have not really read the Gospels." And he admitted he hadn't really done that. He'd simply seen the violence in the world and come to a false, but an understandably false conclusion. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this. There are many voices in the world today that say there's nothing good in Christianity. And I want to correct that. Because it's very easy to make these kind of assertions. Now, the younger people will know that one of the very popular topics in universities and colleges around the world now is well-being. What does it mean for a human to thrive? What is the secret of the good life? Now, these are questions that were asked in the ancient world, but the idea of well-being and human prosperity and thriving is becoming more and more an academic field. People are very interested in it because they're not sure what is involved in human well-being. Now, the very interesting thing is that I'm not a sociologist, so if I'm going to get any information about these kind of things, I have to have a word with the experts. And Richard Dawkins has famously said that God is a delusion. And that's a psychiatric term, and I'm going to address that question tomorrow night somewhere in the remotenesses of these islands. I'm not going to address it tonight. But simply to say, he's making an assertion outside his own field, which I'm doing tonight all the time, by the way. And I'm very aware of it. When you go outside your own field, and mine's mathematics, you need to check with the experts. Is it true that no good has resulted from Christianity? Now, as I say, other religions, their representatives must organize meetings and talk on their behalf. I'm concentrating on Christianity. So let's go to one of the world's leading atheists, Jürgen Habermas. He's a brilliant intellectual living in Germany. And he warned recently against the attempt to get rid of religion. Why? He said, I'm an atheist, but for many people in the world, religion is a very important source of generating meaning. Now he becomes more specific. And he writes this. I'm not going to read the quote. It's in quite complicated philosophical language. I'm just going to simplify it. And it goes basically like this. He's talking about where do we get our ideals of human freedom from? Where do we get the morality of conscience? Where do we get human rights? Where do we get concepts of democracy? Here is his answer to that. All of these things are, I quote, the direct legacy of the Jewish ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. Now, he's writing as an atheist, but he's writing historically. And he says all of these things, human rights, democracy, morality of conscience, and freedom, come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. To this day, he goes on, there is no alternative to it. Everything else is just idle, postmodern talk. That's a very strong and interesting statement. And I found it fascinating when I first read it. Because as an atheist, he has no particular religious axe to grind. He's simply commenting on history. I'm at Oxford University. As you know, its motto, Dominus illuminatio mea. The Lord is my illumination. The people that founded Oxford, Cambridge, and virtually all the major universities of Europe were believers in God. They gave us a system of education. And yet, in so many of them, their motto still stands. but they've long since abandoned the faith in God that led to those centers of learning. We're a very odd generation because for centuries, trust in God and learning belonged together. Science of all kinds, natural science, the humanities, and faith in God all belong together. And yet now we've lived to pushing them separately for all kinds of reasons that I can't go into this evening. So it's very interesting to me that historically we owe a great deal. I presume you've got a hospital in these islands, and you've got hospices. Where did those come from? Christianity. We must not, those of us who are Christians, hide the fact that there's a huge debt owed to the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition in our world. Now, the next thing that's very interesting is the work that has been done on well-being. Now, when I noticed the title of the book, The God Delusion, I could see immediately it was a very risky title. Delusion has got psychiatric overtones. Dawkins actually mentions that. And I thought, why don't I go, since I'm not a psychiatrist and he's not, why don't I ask what the psychiatrists say? And I discovered the recent past president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists writing, Andrew Sims. And what he writes is very revealing. He says the advantageous effect of religious belief and spirituality on mental and physical health is one of the best kept secrets of psychiatry and medicine. If the findings of the huge volume of research on this topic had gone in the opposite direction, and it had been found that religion damages your mental health, it would have been front page news in every newspaper in the country. Now, the interesting thing about this is that these studies are, as near as they can be made, serious scientific studies. Dawkins writes God off as a delusion and seems to be totally unaware of this research. That's not very impressive. And when you read Andrew Sims' book, he actually wrote a book called Is Faith a Delusion? And I leave you to read it yourselves since it's not the topic for tonight. But he points out on those things that we can measure. Just listen to this. In the majority of studies, religious involvement is correlated with well-being, happiness, life satisfaction, hope, optimism, purpose, meaning in life, higher self-esteem, better adaptation to bereavement, greater social support, less loneliness, lower rates of depression, faster recovery from depression, lower rates of suicide, fewer positive attitudes towards suicide, less anxiety, less psychosis, lower rates of alcohol and drug abuse, less delinquency, less criminal activity, greater marital stability. That's not bad, is it? It's out there. And this is not just one little study. This is the result of what's called a meta-study, a study of studies. And Sims is making the point that we're not told about it. Why not? Well, I can leave you to guess. It seems to me to be one of the scientific evidences. And of course, if Christianity is true, you would expect it to produce well-being. Of course you would. You see, Dawkins, and I keep hearing his voice in the back of my head because in interacting with him, he'd say, well, of course, just because my worldview is bleak doesn't prove it's wrong. Well, I say, of course, but it doesn't prove it's right either. And if the correlation is not between atheism and well-being, but with belief in God and well-being, then it seems to me that's part of the positive evidence. But I must stop and give you a chance to ask one or two questions. But I'm not going to stop quite yet, because I came across in the Times an amazing statement by Matthew Paris. Matthew Paris is an atheist, and he wrote this, and it caused a very lengthy discussion. You'll see why in a moment. As an atheist, I truly believe that Africa needs God. Missionaries, not aid money, are the solution to Africa's biggest problem. Well, that hit me like a bombshell, so I thought I'd read more. It's absolutely fascinating what he says. He says, those who want Africa to walk tall amid 21st century global competition must not kid themselves that providing the material means will make the change. A whole belief system must first be supplanted. And I'm afraid it has to be supplanted by another. Removing Christian evangelism, this is an atheist writing, from the African equation may leave the continent at the mercy of a malign, that is an evil fusion of Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete. I find that stunningly honest for an atheist to write. What he's saying is that he has observed that Christianity makes a difference to the well-being of people. He's reaching a very different conclusion from the new atheists. But of course, you see, we've all been in the one direction tonight. Is religion poisonous? I want to leave you with this question. Is atheism poisonous? How about that? You see, I mentioned John Lennon and his song Imagine. Do you remember that? Well, I'm not John Lennon. I'm John Lennox. And I hope you've noticed the difference. I've written a song as well. It's called Imagine. I'm not going to sing it, ladies and gentlemen. Imagine a world without Stalin, without Hitler, without Pol Pot, without Mao. What about that world? I don't read anything about that world among the new atheists. What I do read is incredible. I was giving a lecture at the Polish Academy of Sciences a while ago, and I quoted this famous statement, again by Richard Dawkins. I quote him because he's the most influential, by the way. I cannot imagine an atheist who would bulldoze a cathedral like Chartres or Notre Dame. He cannot imagine an atheist doing that. Well, a very witty East German philosopher, Richard Schröder, wrote and said, well, he's right, of course. Cathedrals are too big for bulldozers. Ulbricht and Stalin used dynamite instead. And I was so staggered when I read this, having spent so many months in these parts of the world, how many huge holes in the ground I've looked at, which were formerly churches. And when I mentioned this in Poland, they stopped me in the lecture, and one of the professors sitting in the front row said, send him over to us, and we'll show him. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, this is very serious. To say you cannot imagine an atheist who would do this kind of damage is to rewrite 20th century history. It's very easy to do that. John Gray is one of the very interesting people because, again, he is a very high-powered atheist and he's a professor of the history of European thought, emeritus in London. He writes very interesting stuff. And he points out that there's a pretty direct line between the Enlightenment and the violence of the early 20th century in Russia. You see, I put this to many Russians, of course. And several of them had said something like this. They said, you see, our problem was we thought that we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. And we found we couldn't. We found we couldn't. And that's very poignant, you know. Very poignant. And I often think of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who, when he left Russia and came to America, made a famous speech. And he said, if I am asked why it is 100 million of my fellow citizens perished, and if I'm asked to give a short answer, it is, we have forgotten God. Now, what I'm doing now, you will observe, is raising another question. I'm linking belief in God and the value given to human beings, because that's one of the biggest questions that troubles us in our contemporary society. And many young people are looking for values, because for centuries in Europe, it was the vertical dimension, the God dimension, that determined ultimate human value, because human beings were thought to be made in the image of God. Once you get rid of that, you discover that we're only one species among many. That makes a very big difference to your evaluation of human beings. That's why this is such an important topic. Now, my final point, I said I'd go on for about 3/4 of an hour, and it's about 3/4 of an hour, is that if you ask yourself the question, why did Christ not use violence? The answer is obvious. His message had to do with forgiveness, with peace with God, with receiving a new kind of life, with morality, with fidelity, with integrity, with goodness, and with truth. And Pilate knew, of course, that the one thing you cannot do by violent means is impose truth. It cannot be done. Especially if it's truth about that kind of thing. How could you possibly imagine that you could impose Christ's message of love of God and peace with God by using guns? It's utterly absurd. So my answer to the question, is religion poisonous, is yes, some religion is. And alas, some Christian religion is. Because, and I must say this to be honest, because it's only fair, I meet people who think that they've met Christianity and they've rejected it because it's come across to them as a vast burden of legalistic requirements that they have got to slave away at fulfilling, and they find they can't and they give up. I can understand that. And that's why it's very important to distinguish between that kind of thing and the message that has to do with a God who loves us so much that he came into this world in Christ and gave his life for us, that we can have free forgiveness with no merit at all. But then that's not religion. That's a living relationship with God. Thank you very much indeed.